Hey Lake Point, Pastor Mike here to get you caught up on the final week of our series, Like No Other. It's a series focused on unpacking the question, what is God like? Time and time again, the biblical authors reveal our God to be like no other. They describe him as a God who is compassionate and gracious, who is slow to anger, and who is overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. In week 1 of the series, we talked about his compassion and grace. In week 2, we talked about how he's slow to anger. And this week, Pastor Nate looked at God's loyal love and his faithfulness. In Hebrew, those words are hesed and emet. Now, when it comes to translating from one language to another, it can be tricky. For example, there's no English equivalent to the Hebrew word hesed. As Nate pointed out, the earliest translations by John Wycliffe and William Tyndale use the English word mercy. The New American Standard Bible uses 2 words, loving kindness. The NIV simply translated it as love, and other translations have added the word steadfast or unfailing. However, none of them do a perfect job summarizing what the Hebrew word is actually conveying. Hebrew scholar Daniel Block writes that the Hebrew word hesed cannot be translated with one English word because it's a covenant term, wrapping up in itself all the positive attributes of God. The word hesed appears 245 times in the Hebrew Bible, including 107 times in the book of Psalms. And the best way to describe it is the kind of love that combines loyal commitment, generous sacrifice, and affectionate devotion. The kind of love someone demonstrates when they keep a promise and go above and beyond in doing so. Think of an elderly couple who's been married for a long time and the wife becomes ill and in a wheelchair or bed, but the husband remains devoted to her, joyfully and tenderly caring for her every need. God is abounding in loyal commitment, generous sacrifice, and affectionate devotion. Now, the Hebrew word emet, which we translate as faithfulness, in their literal sense means truth. And it's connected to the word amen, which means essentially, that's true. It's why sometimes people in church shout out, amen. If you didn't grow up in church, that simply just means they're agreeing with what was said. Another way to translate emet, though, is with the word trustworthy. Basically, Yahweh won't let you down. He's reliable and true. To wrap our heads around God's character traits of hesed and emet, we need to understand covenants. And to do that, we need to have a basic grasp of the overall story of the Bible. Because covenant isn't a word we use very much anymore. In the ancient Near East, a covenant was essentially a hybrid between a promise and a legal contract. 2 people would make a promise and then they would sign a contract with clearly defined blessings and curses for keeping or breaking that promise. The closest thing we have in the modern world to a covenant is marriage. Marriage is a covenant. It's a promise to love and stay faithful to your spouse. But a covenant is also a binding contract. When you get married, you sign your life away. There are consequences if you don't keep your promise. And if you know the story of the Bible, it has a lot to do with Yahweh making covenants. One of those key moments is found in Genesis chapter 12. To give you context, at this point in the story, Yahweh's good and beautiful world had been defaced by evil. And so, what does God do? He calls a random desert Bedouin named Abram to get the story back on track. And the first thing God does with Abram is he makes a covenant, a promise. He says, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you. Now, you may have noticed there's a lot of I will language, and that's covenant language. God promises Abram that his family will become a great nation, and he promises to bless this nation. Not just that he will bless all the people of the earth through this nation. So there's a pattern. It starts with God, and then the people of God, and then that blessing pours out to the world. God's saying he's going to make everything right that is wrong in our world. Everything that has been come undone, he's going to put back together. And he's going to accomplish this redemptive, restorative, recreative work through Abraham's family, which you probably know as the nation of Israel. And this promise later becomes a full-fledged covenant because a few chapters later, Abraham is up against the wall and it looks like Yahweh has been unfaithful to his promise. Years have passed and Sarah, his wife, is still childless, and now they're both elderly, way past the age to have a baby. Yet God in Genesis 15 does something really weird. Yahweh tells Abraham to gather some animals and make a sacrifice, a bull, a goat, a ram, and a few birds. And so Abraham takes the animals and he cuts them in half and he spreads them out on the ground. In the ancient Near East, this was called cutting the covenant, and you would cut the animals in half and lay them in 2 parallel lines. Then the 2 parties would walk through the makeshift pathway of dead animals as a symbolic way of saying, if I don't keep my end of the promise, then may this happen to me, blood and death. But that's when the story takes a bizarre turn. Yahweh makes Abraham fall into a deep sleep, and in it, Abraham sees a vision of God, that of a smoking fire pot, walking through the animals. And Yahweh does this all by himself. It's Yahweh's way of saying that even if Abraham and his children don't keep their end of the bargain, he's still going to keep his promise, no matter the cost. And if blood has to be spilled, it won't come from Abraham, it will come from Yahweh himself. He's willing to die and become like these animals just to keep his promise to bring the world back to life. You connecting the dots with what Jesus did on the cross? Really, the rest of the Bible is about Yahweh faithfully keeping his covenant with Abraham's family, whereas Abraham's family, Israel, fails miserably time and time again. All throughout history, Yahweh has been faithful. Adam and Eve failed, Yahweh was faithful. Abraham and Israel failed, Yahweh was faithful. You and I fail, God is faithful. Faithful to do what? To bless and heal and free and save. John Mark Comer describes it this way, that Jesus takes all of our failure, thousands of years of broken promises, and he drags it to the cross, absorbing in it his death and then breaking its hold over humanity through his resurrection. And this is why the writers of the New Testament are constantly quoting from the Old Testament. For them, the gospel starts in Genesis 12, not Matthew 1. Yahweh made a promise, and he was faithful to the point of death. And he's still not done. He promises to one day return in power and usher in his kingdom reign here on earth as it is in heaven. And that, friends, is a God who is like no other. Enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next series.